Communicators several perspectives on a study that measures how brain activity changes due to cell phone use.
Joining us on the Communicators is Dr. Nora Volkow, who is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And recently, Dr. Volkow, you conducted a study on cell phones. What was that study?
The study was done to try to find out if the human brain is sensitive to the electromagnetic radiation that is emitted by cell phones, which is not an obvious answer because this is a very low intensity. And prior studies that have been done to address that question have provided with very inconclusive results. Some show increases in activity, some show decreases, some show no changes, some show decreases and increases. So it was very difficult to extract information that could answer that question. Is the human brain sensitive to the intensities of electromagnetic radiation that are deposited in your brain when you are using a cell phone just for regular communications?
So if that was the question you were looking to answer, what is the answer?
Well, we found that after 50 minutes of exposure of a cell phone, the areas of the brain that were closest to the antenna showed increased consumption of glucose. Now, glucose is the way that the brain extracts energy in order to perform its function. So when you are activating an area of the brain, you see an increase in glucose consumption. Thus, what we were observing was what appears to be an increase in activity of the areas of the brain that were close to the antenna.
So what else would increase brain glucose? Thinking, sports, etc.?
If you're functioning, if you're alive, your brain will be consuming glucose. And the only situation where you will see no glucose consumption is in a dead brain. And I'm saying this very clearly because this is not like a pathological response. This is a physiological response on the way that brain requires to perform its functions. So for example, as I look at you, the areas of my brain that are involved in visual processing, the light, those areas are consuming much more glucose than if, for example, I had my ears closed. Because if I had my ears closed, of course, no stimulus comes through. So that's a visual cortex. And the amount of glucose that would be increased or consumed by the visual cortex on my brain is going to be dependent on the complexity of the visual stimuli that I have in front of me, which is, in this case, a person, a lot of objects around me. So that's a complex scene. So how much glucose is likely to be increased in my visual cortex? Based on the literature, I say probably a lot, between 20–50%. So this is one of the areas that requires the most glucose consumption in performing a task. When I'm speaking, for example, the areas involved with language may be consuming 10–15% more glucose than if I were silent. So there's significant variability depending on the area of the brain that you're studying on the one hand, but also on the complexity of operation that you may be performing or the complexity of the stimulation that you're being exposed to. So what we observed when you have the cell phone like this, and by the way, the cell phone is muted, because of course if there's noise, that would activate the contralateral auditory cortex in terms of hearing. So it's transmitting a text that has been recorded, but it's muted. So what you have here in terms of increasing metabolism, which is very close to the antenna in this area here, we are interpreting to reflect the electromagnetic radiation emitted from the antenna. And that increase in glucose consumption was approximately 7%.
7%?
7%. So it's in the low range, but it's in the physiological range.
Now, you have a slide here that you provided to us, and this is with the cell phone off, a brain scan.
Yeah.
And this is the front of the brain, correct?
Correct.
The part up at the top. And then with the cell phone on,
yeah.
And you see a lot more yellow in the front of the brain here, if you'd explain that, as well as you see a change in the red core. Is there anything significant about that?
Well, the colors just are used to scale the amount of glucose consumed. And this is a rainbow scale, so the red is the areas that have the highest consumption. So as you compare the images of the brain off versus the images of the brain on, you see in this area, it's actually this area of the brain, I mean the axial plane like this, on the top of your eyes, which is the area that has the closest relationship with the antenna. So those areas, when you compare on-off, you see more red and more yellow, which is an indication of the fact that glucose consumption is higher under those conditions. And you can, using these images, these are just visual display of numbers that are scaled in different colors. But you can draw regions of interest, extract a particular area in the frontal cortex, measure specifically the average activity of glucose consumption, and compare the on-off. And when you do that, that's when, on average, we're seeing a 7% increase in glucose utilization that you're visually observing as more reds and yellows.
Well, the question that everybody is asking, Dr. Volkow, is this an indication of danger? When you're talking about the the electronic magnetic forces that are being emitted?
I wish I could answer that question because everybody has asked me and I feel just frustrated. I can't. I would love to say our study is able to clarify this controversial issue of whether cell phones could be harmful to the brain, but the reality is our study cannot. What our study does tell us is that the human brain appears to be sensitive to this electromagnetic radiation that's emitted for cell phones. Whether this is harmful or not, that is something that needs to be addressed by future studies. And it is important in many perspectives. If in fact, say, and I say not saying that it is, but studies were to show that there is long-lasting consequences that could be negative, then the question is how can you avoid them? And it's very easy. It's very easy to avoid, even if they do show that. You just don't put the cell phone by the side of your head. You use it far away because the intensity of the current emitted from the cell phone rapidly decreases as a function of the distance. So if I have my cell phone 1 feet away from me, the exposure of my brain is going to be minimal. So that's one, assuming that it shows that there is a negative effect. On the other hand, if it does not show that there are negative effects, me as a neuroscientist, obviously I love the concept of could we start to apply this technology for therapeutic purposes? Could one use, for example, this type of stimulation to activate areas of the brain where it may be therapeutically beneficial? And again, that is a scientific question that needs to be addressed, provided that there's no evidence that there are harmful effects. So whichever way the field shows, whether there is or there's not, I think that it is extremely interesting, certainly to my brain, that it is sensitive to these very weak electromagnetic currents.
What are REEMFs and what other devices or how else do we receive them?
Well, the electromagnetic radiation that you are getting from cell phones, it has a certain frequency and power that is distinct from other types of wireless technology. For example, your regular phones that is wireless, but it's not a cell phone technology, has much less power than a regular cell phone. So, and the physicists with which I work estimated it to be somewhere at least approximately 100-fold less powerful. So that is, so you need to consider the intensity, the power of your signal on the one hand. The other thing that is very relevant for physiological processes has to do with the frequencies. And the way at which cell phones transmit is in the giga to low megahertz frequencies, which is very, very different to devices that may be dependent on extremely low frequency waves, and which have been shown, some of those, to do affect electroencephalographic signals in the human brain. So the frequency is very important. The other aspect of these radiations that has been shown by investigators to be relevant is the control of the amplitudes, which has a very slow frequency pattern. So apparently there are multiple factors and variables that determine ultimately the extent to which biological tissue may be or may not be sensitive to this exposure. So you cannot just equate one type of energy emitted by cell phones, say, for example, another type of energy emitted by other devices, including your laptop, which requires wireless technology.
So are REMFs being emitted from laptops as well?
Well, there are electronic currents that are very, very weak, that much weaker than anything on the cell phone, for which, to my knowledge, there has been no concerns with respect to health effects.
Now, can you compare the amount of radioactivity that we're receiving through a cell phone to an X-ray or to maybe an airport screening machine?
Those are two different types of radiation. One is based on ionizing radiation that has very specific properties and for which there is clear-cut evidence that at a certain range it can be harmful and has been associated with cancer. And that's why there are very strict limits in terms of how much ionizing radiation you can expose your body. And at the extreme, like on an atomic bomb, we all know the adverse consequences with respect to markedly increasing the risk for cancers. So that's a very different type of radiation. The type of radiation also interacts with biological tissues in a very different way than electromagnetic radiation or radio frequencies. So they are very distinct, and in the one case for ionizing radiation, no one questions that at high levels or at a certain threshold, it does increase the risk for cancer. That is not necessarily the case for electromagnetic radiations, provided that they are following the standards imposed by the regulatory agencies. And those standards actually are based very much on a threshold after which there should be no heating of the tissue. So the regulatory agencies are concerned that your cell phone does not emit energies that will heat the tissue through microwave radiation. And my understanding is that all of the devices do follow very rigorously these strict regulations.
Dr. Volkow, is your study the first of its kind, or have other studies been done like this? And if so, is your study consistent with the results that the other studies have shown?
There have been many studies to try to understand whether cell phone exposures affects human brain function, and they have used a variety of technologies, looking, for example, very simple, like does it interfere with your ability to memorize, cognitive tests? Does it interfere with electroencephalographic signals? Does it interfere with the excitability of the tissue when you send a magnetic pulse? And there have been also studies that have been done using imaging technologies like the one we use, which is positron emission tomography. But those studies have focused, they differ on ours, on a very important thing. All of those studies measure cerebral blood flow. We're the first study to measure
cerebral blood flow.
Cerebral blood flow, which actually is the main mechanism by which the brain delivers nutrients, glucose, oxygen. But it's also a main mechanism by which the brain cools the tissue. So the brain has to maintain temperatures at very, very narrow windows. And so if there is a certain increase in temperature, blood flow will be increased into that area to bring it down. Glucose metabolism, on the other hand, directly measures the level of neuronal activity of the tissue, so which is a function, of course, of what type of stimulation, what type of processing it's performing. So they differ in those two, and that very important. One was done on blood flow, and there's been studies by 3 independent laboratories that have measured the effects on cerebral blood flow. This is the first study that has measured effects on brain glucose metabolism. Now, when you are the last study, you take advantage of learning what all of the others have done, right? And one of the things that had been in my brain worrisome about the prior studies, of course, when you look retrospectively, it's easier to say, is that basically all of those studies were done in a very small sample size, very few subjects. I think that the largest study may have been 14 or at the most 16 subjects. Now, that is okay if you are expecting a large effect. So if I study the effects of eyes closed versus eyes open, 10 subjects will be sufficient for me to show that effect. But with cell phones, where we actually expected a very small effect, because if it were a big effect, we would see it behaviorally, we then power our study to be able to detect a small effect, which was not the case for any of the prior imaging studies, and which may have been one of the reasons why we were able to show a significant effect like the one that we showed, that is linked with the exposure close to the antenna. Having said that, other studies, there was a study that showed with cerebral blood flow that was significant that the area of the antenna, in that case the antenna was here, there was a decrease in cerebral blood flow, and that was significant. So it's really opposite to what we're observing, where we are seeing an increase in the areas near to the antenna. And that study also shows significant increases in blood flow far away from the antenna. So it's very difficult to integrate with what we observe, which is increases in glucose consumption close to the antenna and nothing significant far away from the antenna. Now, there's the third difference between the methodologies that we're using. And this has to do with the method itself. When you're measuring blood flow with this technology, positron emission tomography, you are averaging the activity of the brain over 60 seconds, which is good for certain things. Whereas if you're measuring brain glucose metabolism, you're averaging the activity over 20 to 30 minutes. So if you're interested on observing a cumulative effect of stimulation, then having a window of 20 to 30 minutes increases your sensitivity for detection as opposed to having a window of 60 seconds. And I always use the metaphor of a camera. So if you have very low levels of light and you are opening your aperture for a very short period of time, the likelihood that you take a picture and observe the photograph is very low, as opposed if you leave it wide open, and of course not moving it, but just wide open, that will allow you to extract a photograph even when the light conditions are very low. So I am using that metaphor to say the other advantage of using a technology that allows us to integrate and average the activity that is occurring over a 30-minute period.
Dr. Volkow, you're the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Mm-hmm. Why are you conducting this study on cell phones?
Well, it is a convoluted story, but what there is a story to the story. What has happened is all of my professional life, I've been very interested on studying the effects of drugs in the human brain. And the main tool that I've used has been imaging technologies. Positron emission tomography is one of the imaging technologies that I have been using in close collaboration with my team at Brookhaven National Laboratory. But the other imaging technology that we've been also extensively using is magnetic resonance imaging. Magnetic resonance imaging relies on magnetic fields, static and changing, in order to see how the brain functions. So for the past 15 years, our group has been interested on, it has been investigated whether in fact the properties of the magnetic fields used in MRI imaging by themselves could have an effect on brain function. So when we started the first study 15 years ago, it was the static magnetic fields, and we showed that static magnetic fields overall don't seem to affect glucose metabolism in the brain. But we recently showed that in contrast, when you are using gradients, which are moving rapidly, shifting your magnetic currents, then we see a significant change in glucose metabolism in the human brain. And those results, which were very unexpected, in my brain immediately said, if we are seeing an effect, not on the properties of the field that is constant, but one that is changing, that is to say, it's not necessarily the intensity of the magnet itself if it's static, but its frequencies that may be relevant on the way that biological systems respond to it, that led us to study whether cell phones would affect brain glucose metabolism. So it came because we were trying to understand how the imaging tools that are used to understand how the human brain functions could, through the use of changing magnetic fields, affect the brain. That's how we came to study.
How was the study conducted?
Well, it was studied. We recruited initially 48 subjects, and they were brought into the laboratory, and testing were done to ensure that these were healthy controls. All of these subjects had histories of cell phone exposures. They were tested on 2 different days, and the order of the days was randomized. on every given day, the subjects had 2 cell phones placed, one on the left and one on the right, and these were secured by a muffler to ensure positioning. The upper part of the cell phone was to the ear, the lower part was to the mouth. The subjects did not know whether the cell phones were off or on, nor did they know whether the right or the left cell phone would be on. And this was done because we did not want the effects of expectation. So if I have a cell phone here, I may have, prior to my experience with using cell phones, expect and make me alert to try to figure out if something that could confound our results. So in order to control for expectations, we put 2 cell phones. And for half of the subjects, the first day, the right phone was on, and for the other half, on that first day, both phones were off. We started, deactivated the phones 20 minutes before, actually it was 30 minutes before we started, before we injected them with the radioactive glucose, because we wanted a long-lasting exposure. 30 minutes after initiation of the stimulation, we inject the radioactive glucose and maintain the cell phones on for 20 more minutes. And that allowed for a total 50 minutes of cell phone exposure. At the end of that 20 minutes, cell phones were turned off. The patients were brought into the scanner, laid into the scanner, and then we measure brain glucose metabolism, which takes approximately 20 minutes to obtain those images. But those images, what you are doing there is measuring the glucose that has been trapped over those first 30 minutes. And that's why it allows you to average the activity of what occurred in that period. And so then once you're measuring, the glucose is already trapped and it's not going to change. So it's allow you to take a fixed photograph of what happened just before you took the persons into the camera.
Do you use a cell phone up to your ear?
I use the cell phone all the time, but I don't use it up to my ear. Because
Why?
I'm a neurotic. I say always I'm neurotic when it comes to the brain. My perspective on something like this, and again, I do not know if there is any harm, and it's interesting to look at history and how people react to new technologies with fear, and when we look at it into the back, I says, well, how could they have been afraid? And I was looking at for electricity. People were afraid of electricity. So, but it's normal. We don't know about that technology, and it turned out that there's nothing harmful. On the other hand, radiation. We were not afraid as physicians on radiation, and it turned out that there are harmful effects. So because I don't know, and there's such an easy solution since I love my cell phone, why not? I mean, it doesn't cost me anything. It's to me a non-brainer. Well, let the scientists figure it out if there is or is there not harmful effects. I can have my cake and eat it too. I can use the cell phone and minimize any potential, if there is, negative effects just by keeping the cell phone far away from my head.
What about the use of a Bluetooth or some other ear device?
We have not evaluated the Bluetooth, and I think it is important to evaluate the Bluetooth. So again, until we have more information, it is very difficult to determine whether one should have any concerns or not at all. I don't think there's information.
Who funded this study and what was budgeted for it?
Well, you know, I have two lives. One of them is I direct the National Institute on Drug Abuse, but the other life of mine is an investigator. So this study is a result of my life as an investigator, and my laboratory is part of the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And it's a study that was done at Brookhaven National Laboratory, which is where I keep my laboratory.
So fully funded by the U.S. taxpayer?
Fully funded by the U.S. taxpayer. There's no private companies.
Dr. Nora Volkow is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She also conducted the most recent cell phone study, which you can find online at cspan.org/communicators. Dr. Volkow, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And now joining us on the Communicators is Dr. Kenneth Foster, who is a bioengineering professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who has done a lot of research on radio frequency energy. Dr. Foster, we've been talking with Dr. Volkow about the cell phone study conducted by her group with NIH. What's your opinion of this study?
Well, I think it will be very hard to interpret for one thing, the subjects received almost no exposure, and the effect they reported was very small. And so it will be very hard to understand what it means.
Does it matter what kind of phone they used in the study?
Well, it does. This particular phone they used, that was a Samsung handset, and I can't imagine a phone that's less able to produce exposure to somebody's brain.
Why do you say that?
Well, the antenna was located at the very bottom of the phone, as far away from the brain as possible, and the pattern of absorption in the head was pretty much limited to the cheek and the jaw. Another problem was that the phone was receiving a message from somebody else, and these kinds of phones, under those conditions, only transmit infrequently just to tell the system that it's still connected. And so the level of radiation from the phone was quite low. And also with those phones, the level of transmission is determined by how strong the signal is from the local base station. These are always powered down to provide the lowest level of communication possible. And so given these factors, and also the phone was some distance from the head. The author said they used a muffler or something between the phone and the head. And so given these uncertainties, there's really no way of knowing what the exposure was. But I'm quite sure that it's extremely low. In fact, this was basically a homeopathic study, very tiny levels of exposure.
So, Dr. Foster, when you, if they had used an iPhone or a Droid, you think there would have been different results? Do different cell phones emit different radio frequencies?
Yes, and they emit different power levels, but since the level of transmission is so variable depending on all sorts of things, they would really have had to have worked in collaboration with an engineer who understands these things and could perhaps use a cell phone which had been modified to put out a given level of signal. As it is, there's no way to even guess what exposure the subjects received to their brains other than knowing that it's very low.
So when you look at the plethora of studies that have been done on cell phone use and its potential effects on the brain, do you have a conclusion at all?
Yes, and my conclusion is basically that of health agencies that have looked at this, which is that there have been many reports of studies. There have been a number of effects that have been reported from cell phone use, but they're all small, they have no clear biological significance, and they tend to come and go. And so there's really no clear evidence after all these years that there are significant health effects from using mobile phones.
Now, do you have any connection with the cell phone companies in your research, sir?
No, I'm a professional engineer, and sometimes I provide calculations to determine whether transmitting facilities comply with federal regulations, but that's quite a different thing.
Dr. Kenneth Foster, Bioengineering Department at the University of Pennsylvania, thank you for being on the Communicators.
Nice to be with you.
In 2010, a book came out. It was called Disconnect, and it was written by Devra Davis. Devra Davis, in your book and in your presentation about your book, you said you went from 3 cell phones to no cell phones. Is that correct, and why?
No, I didn't go to none. I still have 1, but I certainly gave up my 3, and I did it because I began to learn that contrary to what Mr. Foster just told you, a number of health agencies have issued warnings about cell phones, some of them as long ago as 10 years. I learned that the British government had a review group that looked at the evidence on cell phones in the year 2000, and I was stunned because I thought I knew what was going on to learn that they recommended back then that teenagers be very limited in their use of cell phones.
Now, when you look at the NIH study and you look at the slide showing the increased brain glucose activity, what's your conclusion?
Well, I think it's a stunning piece of work, and I certainly agree with Mr. Foster. The exposures were quite low, and that's why we need to be very concerned. What I have done in my book, Disconnect, is to show that Dr. Volkow's study was not a breakthrough in terms of showing the effects on the brain, but it was one of the most elegant pieces of work ever done. The reason I say it wasn't a breakthrough is that other research, which I document in my book, Disconnect, found in 1994 that pulsed microwave radiation to the brains of rats could unravel their DNA, and then research in 2002 done in Finland showed that you could get an effect on cerebral blood flow from cell phone radiation, and then in 2006 other studies were done also in Finland, showing that you could alter brain energy after cell phone use. Unfortunately, many of these studies, in the case of one, appeared in Finnish language and others in English, have not garnered the headlines. Of course, Dr. Volkow is to be commended because she's such an eminent researcher, and this study was a controlled study where they looked at the same person when they did not have the phone next to their head and when they did. So even though the exposures were quite low, and the phone was simply seeking, as phones do, to get information from a tower with nothing else going on, there was a significant change in brain glucose in exactly those areas of the brain that we model exposure gets into. And we know where exposure gets in the brain because of studies that have been done by the cell phone industry that I discuss in my book as well that show that children absorb about twice as much exposure into their brains as do adults. And that's why we're very concerned, and we're starting a cell phone safety awareness campaign with Pyle Middle School here in Bethesda and around the country in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Missoula, Montana, where we're working with teachers and parents to promote cell phone safety. We're not opposed to phones. We just want people to be aware of the safe ways to use them, particularly around children.
Well, the wireless industry responded to the NIH study, and this is what they had to say, Dr. Davis. The peer-reviewed scientific evidence has overwhelmingly indicated that wireless devices within the limits established by the FCC do not pose a public health risk or cause any adverse health effects.
Well, that's actually a misreading of the literature. As I just indicated, there are studies that have shown that cell phone radiation affects the brain. They've been around for a while. In fact, governments in Israel and Britain have recently issued new warnings about reducing direct radiation to the brain for everyone. The British government health pamphlet was just reissued March 6th, and it says all people should be encouraged to text rather than hold a phone next to their head or use a headset or a speakerphone. And I think that makes sensible advice, and I think it's unfortunate that with all of the things going on right now in Washington, our government has not caught up with what others in the world are advising on this, and that the industry continues to invoke the same advice it's been invoking for 20 years. The fact is, this is a fast-moving science. We have got to update our understanding of the issue, and we're in the midst of an experiment on ourselves and our children with no controls, because so many of us, including me, are using cell phones today. But I don't hold a phone next to my brain anymore.
Deborah Davis is the author of Disconnect. She is also the founder of the Environmental Health Trust, and she's been our guest on the Communicators.
Thank you so much.
Now, the Communicators invited the wireless industry to participate in this program, and they chose not to. Also, if you would like to read the NIH study on cell phone use for yourself, you can go to cspan.org/thecommunicators. Thanks for being with us.